So I'm working on performance at the moment. That's my least favourite thing to do. Optimisation is the other word for it. Making the game run faster. It actually runs fine on my computer, my home computer, because it's an extremely fast one. But there are two reasons I want it to run well on other computers. One is that I'm going to sell the game to other people, not all of whom have the same computer. And the other, much more important reason is for myself. Because I also work on a laptop a lot of the time. I use a MacBook Air with Windows on it, and it's pretty good, but it's not a gaming machine really. And so I want the final game of Heat Signature to run well on a computer like that. But in an ideal world, I don't want to be optimizing all the way through. Like I always kind of thought that you should. I always hear that a game's been delayed or something to optimize it to make it run faster or whatever. And when you see something in development, either being a beta tester or when covering it as a journalist, you're often told, it doesn't run well yet because we do that at the end. So I was going to leave that to the end, but then once it started to run like shit on my laptop, I kind of had to optimize as I go, which I don't want to do because optimizing is the worst kind of code for lots of reasons. One is that it's just very technical, it's just about how computers work on the underneath. You need to understand how memory is used, how textures are loaded, things like that. And it's not that I find that boring exactly, it's just that I don't know any of that stuff. So every single inch of performance I get is going to be one with blood, sweat and tears. It's going to just take so much, and it's one of those things where knowing a little bit is not that great. You kind of need to have the whole picture to really understand why, when I changed that, why did it suddenly go slow? So that's not great. But then the worst thing about it is that at the end of it, really, it's nice that it runs fast on my laptop, but it's still the same game. It's still the game I already had on my computer upstairs. Nothing brand new and magical has happened. I've just made it, now I have the thing I already had, but on a different computer. And that's not an exciting goal for me. That's like, yeah, it needs doing, but it's just, And so, I guess actually that's a separate point in itself. I was moving on to the much worse thing, which is that not only is the goal itself not exciting, but the work you do to achieve that goal, to make the code run faster, isn't like any of the other code you do. Everything else you do, you're either adding features, expanding the game, making it do more stuff, or you're recoding, refactoring, and improving the things you've already done to make them more robust, more stable, more versatile, more features can plug into them, fewer bugs, that kind of stuff. All of which is making the code better. It's all making the game better. And making the game run faster is making it better in that sense. But in every other sense, you're making the code worse. Now, I'm sure some programmers won't like me saying that, but from my perspective, I'm working on a big project by myself, code-wise, and so I'm always trying to be kind to my future self and make the code sort of just flexible and reliable and universal and versatile, so that when later I come to plug something new into that old code that I can't remember how it works, the old code will behave in a nice way and not suddenly crash because it wasn't expecting me to plug that in. And the problem with optimization code is that it makes your code more complicated. The stuff you add isn't... you might think that simple, short, clean, beautiful code runs fast. It doesn't. That runs reliably. That's great. It's very readable. It's great to work with later on, great to plug things into, and that's what I'd like my code to be like. But to make things run fast, you have to keep adding exceptions. You keep having to say, ultimately you're trying to cheat. The thing I want to do in Heat Signature is have this massive galaxy, I think it's 11 million pixels by 11 million pixels, and it's all one big coherent world. There's no separate map mode. When you zoom in, you are just zooming in on a massive, massive space. And I have 150 space stations in that. They're connected by probably about 250 trade routes connecting each other. And I, until now, have had all of that stuff just existing at all times. And if you zoom out far enough, it's all drawn, which means 150 draw calls for the space stations, 250 for the trade routes. And one of the things I've learnt partially through this process is that when you're drawing transparent things on top of each other, that's kind of the most expensive kind of drawing you can do. So it's inefficient, performance-wise, but it's real. It is simulating what it appears to be simulating. There isn't any cheating going on. It's just that's the real, what you see is what you get kind of thing. You are seeing the simulation, which I love, because it means the simulation you won't kind of catch it out. If you do something unexpected, it will respond in the expected way. And that's why I love in gameplay as well, is reliable, universal, kind of true systems. They don't have to be realistic, but they have to be internally consistent and behave. Once you understand the rule, they should behave the way you expect. And now, because that turns out that doesn't run at all well on my laptop, and just in general, we've been piling stuff on and on and on. It's been running slower and slower on my laptop, and it's finally hit the point where it's just really unpleasant to work on it, because if you run the game and the game runs like shit, even the thing you're testing, and the thing you're testing is like, how does combat feel? Then combat feels shit, because the game runs shit. You've ruined the game. So it really is something you have to fix. And fixing it just involves adding all these things about just cheats, just little hacks to say, okay, rather than simulating all those 150 space stations at all times, if you're zoomed in, then we turn the other ones off. And in fact, a lot of on top of all those 150 stations and 250 trade routes-ish, the entire galaxy itself is made up of these vast vapor clouds, which are all a unique sprite that is randomly coloured and rotated and stuff, and is being shown in real time all stacked on top of each other. So again, drawing transparent stuff on top of each other, big stuff is the worst thing you can do for performance. And so what I've done lately, I was looking into this stuff and it was getting really depressing. Because adding those, I just want to finish that point about exceptions. Adding these exceptions and cheats and hacks and stuff makes your code harder to work with, makes it less reliable, means if a player does do something unexpected, if a player teleports, for example, and we were expecting to move slowly, now the galaxy has to catch up and kind of quickly assemble itself. And loads of the bugs you find in big AAA release games are to do with things that they were trying to get away with for performance. You can in Half-Life 2 you can stand in the right place and see that there's only half of the chess set over there is actually built. Each little piece on the chessboard, only half of it really exists. If you go on the other side isn't in the game because they didn't want to simulate it because it saves on performance. So there's so many little things like that. That's not a really big one actually, but it can lead to proper crashes and just completely the game failing. And your code is messier, it's harder to read, it's harder to work with. So the thing I've been trying to do, the biggest drain was just this galaxy. It was just a huge place full of crazy stuff, all of which was drawn in the most inefficient way and always being drawn live. And the other way to draw things in GameMaker is that you can kind of create a canvas and paint on it, and after you've painted on it, the game doesn't really care how many things were painted on it, because they no longer exist. It is like a canvas. If you paint it's the equivalent of holding up a bunch of transparent sort of drawings of clouds in front of a blank canvas versus actually painting those drawings onto the canvas. And if you paint onto the canvas, you only have to draw that one canvas, and you can draw as many times to it as you like and draw as many things on it as you like, and it'll never take any more CPU to display or graphics performance or whatever. So that's good, but there's a limit to how big you can make those canvases. And my canvas is the size of a galaxy. And the smaller, I can stretch it, whatever size the canvas is, I can stretch it to as big as it needs to be. But the smaller the original canvas was, the blurrier it gets. It's like, I've painted it, let's say the canvas has a grid on it, a bit like pixels, and I'm only allowed to fill in those grids, it's like a mosaic. Then if I can make a canvas that when you stand 100 meters away from it looks like a real photo, but then as you move closer obviously it's going to get blurrier, and the smaller the canvas was, the blurrier it's going to get when you move close. So that's kind of okay for a lot of things, because the galaxy is blurry, it's gas clouds, and nebulae are the greatest thing ever if you want to zoom in on a big blurry sprite, because they are just a big massive blur. But it's not so good for space stations, they kind of look like stars on the map, and if you draw those small and then zoom in, you start to get, you can start to see the pixels basically, because they look like circles when you zoomed out, but when you zoom in you discover that actually at that resolution the circle is only about 4 pixels. There's no way to draw a smooth circle with 4 pixels. And when you blur it, it's better than seeing 4 giant pixels, but it's still obviously a kind of cross shape beneath it, or there's geometric kind of distortion. And so really when you zoom in on it, I need to start displaying a real station. It can't be fake anymore. And that's it's balanceable. It's kind of, you can keep it spinning, because if you're zoomed in, you can't see very many stations. And so I do have to show you them for real, but I can start drawing them live then. And that business of switching those things in and out is difficult. I kind of knew it would be difficult, because like I say, it's exceptions, it's special cases, and you can pan the view incredibly fast in heat signature right now. Maybe I'll restrict that. But you know, if you're looking at the entire galaxy and then you hold down shift to move the mouse, the view goes vroom, and so it's shooting past like 100 stations a second. So I can't sort of guarantee that you'll be moving slowly and load things in ahead of time. And you can zoom in very fast as well, so I can't, you know, you can take me by surprise in all kinds of ways if I'm trying to make things up when you arrive. And that's why cheating is so hard in this. But I did that anyway, because I looked at so many other things that could help performance. There's loads of other things that heat signature is doing that are a bit taxing, and just to test before I tried to optimize them, I tried just disabling them, just taking them out. And I took out like 3 of the biggest drains on performance, and then ran the game and it still ran like shit. So I had to find something that was just going to be huge. And this, when I kind of tested it, it was going to be huge if it worked. But could it work? Could I ever get it looking right? Could I ever, you know, seamlessly fade in these live sprites on top of the blurry, blocky canvas? Turns out yes, but it took about 4 days of work, which is really galling to me because, like I said in a previous video, I was hitting like 1 feature a day. I was adding a feature to the game every day, and that's amazing. It's thrilling and exciting and just magic to be building this thing on the seat of, in the seat of your pants, by the seat of your pants. I don't really have the mental image to correct my grammar on that. But that's fantastically exciting. Performance is the least exciting, worst, most horrible thing in the world, and it took longer than the exciting stuff as well. So it was brutal, but just now, so I haven't finished that feature, but it did work. I mean, it kind of started working a couple of days ago, and then it had lots of flaws and bugs and weird things. And in the process of ironing those out, I managed to actually do a couple of the other optimization things I was going to do. Like I think I mentioned before that in heat signature you actually stay still and everything else moves past you. That's because I thought you had to stay in one room. Turns out you don't. So now I've just turned that off. Now you really do move when the camera just follows you, and the world's just kind of infinite. It's not infinite, it's just very, very big. And the problems I thought you'd get if you go really far without recentering the world on you just don't seem to crop up. So that's fine apparently. So I did the canvas thing. We paint the galaxy to a canvas now, and that looks absolutely fine. We paint the stations onto the canvas as well, and when you zoom in, we start to fade in a live sprite on top of it to keep it smooth, and that looks nice. There's a few little noticeable transitions that I can smooth out that I haven't started to kind of try and finesse yet. That's working. And then the problem was that today, at the start of the day, there were still lots of things wrong with it, and the worst thing was that it was kind of juddering as those things got loaded in, and that was really worrying, because if I spent 4 days on it, and it turns out that actually loading this stuff takes up more CPU than just displaying it live in the first place, that would be heartbreaking. But that was actually to do with something else, where there was a double copy of every station in the universe, and they were sort of lying dormant, stacked on top of each other, and also just a tool I've been using to report debug information to help me solve problems turned out to be taking a massive amount of CPU just because of something to do with the way arrays were changing size dynamically. It's not weird that that was a problem, it's not weird that code is garbage, because I didn't know what I was doing when I wrote it, but it is weird because I've been using it for like nearly 2 years now, and it's been just fine until now. Just suddenly it broke. It was to do with some kind of, the number of objects basically. We're dealing with 150 objects for stations, and I guess when you're looping through all of those every frame, and there's a bug that's duplicating them, then you're doing 300 of these debug lock things every frame, and if each one of those is also resizing the array, that gets slow. It's quite nice because I with some help from people on Twitter, I figured that out, and I made that function way more efficient, and also made it nicer to use while I was at it. And then today, after I fixed that, and after I fixed a couple of other things, it just suddenly clicked. And it's really hard to, I can quote the frames per second, and I will, because I'm really proud of it. But earlier, like a little while back, I had a situation where it was saying it had great frames per second, but then you just see these hitches, just little hitches, that don't make a big impact on the average, and I have another stat for like percentage of the frames that were below 50 FPS, like how long did I spend below 50 FPS, because I feel like that's the trouble point. And even that wasn't making a big difference on it, but it's just if that thing isn't smooth, it's garbage, really. And there's this kind of insidious effect that bad performance has on the game where it makes you think things suck that don't. It makes everything else seem bad, and it ruins the feel, and it's weirdly like the game is ill. I've talked about that before. Not in reference to like frame rate exactly, but just in terms of like systems that almost work. And there isn't really a bug exactly, but just this sprite doesn't quite line up to that sprite. There's a gap there. Or over time, this thing can drift out of alignment, and that things like that. They seem very small. They seem like almost polished to fix that. But when they're not working, it feels like the game is ill. It feels like it's actually got some kind of affliction. And then, accordingly, when you cure that, it's just, it's just heaven, it's just brilliant. And so I ran out on my laptop, did a proper test, had a roller coaster ride where initially it was going at about 45 to 50 frames per second, which is no better than it was before and feels really nasty. And I was just like, oh god, I spent 4 days on this and it still isn't working. Then I remembered it's just like the thing that detects where the station should be loaded in. It's supposed to only run every time the camera kind of changes sector. Once you moved into a new zone, then we check, should we load some new stations? Yes, we should. But for debug purposes, to check it was really working robustly, I had it check every frame, which is massively expensive and taking up 70% of the CPU. So I just reloaded, reinstated that little like interval check, and then suddenly it ran really, really well, like 250, 260 FPS or something. It's a bit random because each galaxy is different. And right now I have it loading a new galaxy each time I start it up, just to make sure that I can't inherit bugs from old saved galaxies. And then the next twist of the roller coaster was that I realised the stations weren't loading at all. Like it was running smoothly, but then when I zoomed in on the station, for debug purposes I made them go red if they're being drawn live and white if they're not, so I can tell. And all of them were white, and all of them were really blurry when you zoomed in on them. And then I found out that was due to something else I tried to optimise where I was dynamically fading those live sprites in and out depending on where you zoomed, because at certain zooms they're appropriate and certain zooms they're not. And that code, I took it out recently thinking that it would default to full alpha, i.e. fully opaque, not transparent. But in fact it defaults to 0 alpha, fully invisible. So they were there, but they were just invisible. But for the moment that I thought they weren't there at all, it was heartbreaking because I just celebrated the fact that it had this fantastic frame rate, and then realised that, it has a fantastic frame rate because the stations up don't even exist. Of course it runs well, if they don't exist. Now when I put them back in, maybe it's going to drop down to 50 or 60 or something. But I didn't, and when I restored that, it ran at 300 FPS, and that's fucking bliss. That's not how the final game's going to run on that laptop. That's with a lot of game features disabled, but I was just trying to test, can you cope with all the stations in the world? Can you draw them nicely? Can you load them in and load them out without hitches? And it can, and it's just smooth and beautiful, and I'm relieved, and I may even take a break. Actually, I can't quite take a break. There's a few things I've got to wrap up about this, but after that I'm going to fucking stop working on performance for a long time.